Here we are talking about the economics of prohibition. So here's a quick summary of the chapter with some other additional information just to think about. So what led to prohibition? This was the first constitutional amendment to restrict the freedoms of American citizens. Well, the biggest factor behind this really was the temperance movement. These were women who were experiencing domestic abuse at home at the hands of their inebriated husbands. There was no legal recourse for them to turn to. There was also financial ruin for families whose fathers and husbands were spending money on alcohol. And so it was really the women and the temperance movement that started this throughout the United States. There were some states that had prohibition laws, but this was a push to make it federal. And they turned to a lot of media. In a sense, they held plays, temperance plays, that showed and depicted these horrible men that abused their family as a result of the bottle. Other factors include industrialization, that as you have industrialization, drinking on the job became more dangerous. Unionization, in the sense that after work, industrial workers would gather in the bars and saloons to talk. And oftentimes this is where they talk about collective bargaining and coming together to form unions. So many industrial capitalists and owners of these factories were in favor of prohibition as a way to disband efforts to unionize. At the same time, women were fighting for the right to vote. And the women's suffrage really used this as an issue to be able to show that women need a right to vote as individuals to protect their own freedoms. It also was an issue of immigration and racism. Tied to immigrants and blacks was heavy drinking. And then finally, World War I really changed a lot of the sentiment. This is a war with Germany as one of the Axis powers. And beer was from Germany, and it really started to change the sentiment of Americans on how they viewed alcohol. So these are all different factors that contributed to prohibition. Wayne Bidwell Wheeler is a really important individual. He got injured at a young age as a result of an inebriated worker on the farm. And so he turned to mass marketing. So he would turn in a small town in Ohio to turn to politicians nationwide to market to them to try to change their view on this issue. And so really this is a highlighted example of the effect that mass marketing can have on politics. So here are the laws. The 18th Amendment was passed on January 1919, but it took effect in a year later. And it's very clear what this prohibited: the production, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors. The Volstead Act came along and it defines intoxicated liquors and it establishes punishments for violations of this law. Now this was vetoed by, the Volstead Act was vetoed by President Wilson, but Congress overrides the veto. And so January 1920, prohibition takes effect in the United States. But there's ways around prohibition. One thing we've learned throughout history is when there is a good that individuals desire, when there's a demand for a good, it's really hard to limit markets to prevent those goods from being provided. And so one way around this was through personal supply. Individuals had a whole year in which they could buy alcohol and they could store it for their own personal supply. At the same time, there was great rises in medicinal liquor. CVS pharmacies began to grow, or Walgreens pharmacies blossomed and began to grow out of Chicago because they were the providers, legal providers of alcohol, as long as one had a note from the doctor. Alcotourism became very popular as well, going to other countries where there was non-alcohol, driving boats just off into international waters where one could consume. It also led to the great wine industry within the United States. It was legal for wines to be grown and produced specifically for sacramental purposes within different religions. And so this became very popular and really started the wine industry in California. And the other way around it was simply bootlegging, going to establishments that would illegally provide alcohol to their consumers. So when we talk about illegal goods, it's really an important question to think about, this notion of extensive versus intensive margins. So when we talk about consumption of illegal goods, this is really important. So the extensive margin is this decision of to do or not to do. Do you participate in the illegal activity? The intensive margin is this question is, how much do you participate? So during Prohibition, we have individuals who would go to speakeasies and would engage. And once you get past that barrier, once you can get the alcohol, you've now established the intensive margin. But the challenge with this is because the extensive margin. Because the extensive margin is hard to do, you might get caught. The moment you don't get caught, you might indulge yourself and drink much more than you would normally if it were legal. That's the intensive margin. This discussion really plays out today with Prohibition as college students that are under the age of 21 are prohibited from drinking alcohol. As a result, for those that might go to a bar with a fake ID, that's that extensive margin. And we can measure how many students do this or don't do this. But it's that intensive margin that's a challenge. Because it's illegal, the moment you get to that bar, you might binge drink. And that's where a lot of challenges on campus happen with binge drinking. And that's where happens oftentimes with illegal goods. So was prohibition effective? This is a really important question, and we can look at two outcomes to answer this question. The first is on consumption. Consumption in the United States dropped 42% during prohibition. And you might say that's awesome, that's great. However, in Britain, in the United Kingdom, at the same time period, consumption dropped 41%. And they did not have prohibition. And so it's unclear to how do we attribute this drop in consumption? How much is to prohibition and how much is just changing sentiments within people at this time period? So Angela Dills and Jeffrey Marin look at this, where they look at cirrhosis of the liver. And they show here, and this is scientifically shown, that chronic alcoholism leads to damages of the liver, which can lead to cirrhosis. And they show that countries that have higher rates of consumption of alcohol have higher rates of cirrhosis. And so they look at events of cirrhosis we have medical records for to see, did cirrhosis change during prohibition? And in fact, they find that deaths from cirrhosis dropped 10 to 20% in the United States due to prohibition. Evidence here that prohibition did have an impact on consumption. Another way that Griffin Edwards and Travis Howe look at is they don't look at consumption as much, but they start to look at production, how much alcohol was being produced by looking at the crops that were used to produce alcohol. And they find that during prohibition, decreased production occurred, that prohibition was effective in decreasing the production of crops that were used, barley and others, for alcohol. And they find it also decreased consumption as well. So there is strong evidence to suggest that prohibition was effective in decreasing consumption of alcohol. Now, there were some individuals that did not decrease because of the ways around it. Another outcome to look at is violence. Several studies have looked at it. Emily Owens finds that child abuse decreased during prohibition. She identifies this by looking at deaths to children caused by external forces, specifically trauma and abuse from a drunken father, and finding evidence that yes, violence decreased. Others look at crime, and crime overall increased. But another follow-up study looked at violent crime and it found that violent crime did not decrease. So while crime increased, what really might happen here is that by prohibition, it creates a categories of crime that individuals now can be penalized for. So the sale of alcohol before was legal. If you continue in that business during prohibition, you can now be arrested and commit a crime for the transportation and sale of alcohol. And so this is where it creates a new category of crime and individuals are punished accordingly. But in terms of violent crime, it did not have an immeasurable impact. So how does this relate to us today? And I think this is why it's really important to study prohibition, is prohibiting goods where there's a demand can be very challenging because people find a way around this. So let's look at one example. Let's start with a benign example. Soft drinks. There's many policies that are designed to tax or even prohibit the sale of soft drinks because of an effect they have on obesity and on health concerns. And so policies have been taken to ban soft drinks, specifically in schools. And so David Frisvold looked at what happens when schools ban soft drinks. And what he finds is there's no effect on consumption. And part of that is what he finds is students substitute towards other beverages. Specifically in schools, when soft drinks are banned, students drink chocolate milk and strawberry flavored milk, these flavored milks, which oftentimes have more calories and more sugar than even soft drinks. And that's one of the mechanisms why these bans don't have an impact on obesity. Other mechanisms in research that I look at tries to look at what happens with substitution, meaning that if schools don't sell soft drinks, kids might simply just bring it from home. They might go to the store. In a survey of principals, I find that one principal said, if I don't sell it at school, there's a Walmart a block away. Students will go to Walmart before school and just bring it onto campus. And so he used soft drink sales on campus as a way to generate revenue, knowing that he might have not any impact if he were to ban it on the actual consumption of soft drinks. So now let's go to a less benign example, the legalization of marijuana. Should we legalize marijuana? And this is a question that's actually, it starts with medicinal marijuana, but recently in past years, they've changed it to recreational marijuana. So we talk about making drugs illegal. There is a demand out there for it, so people turn to black markets and underground markets to get access to these goods. So we talk about the war on drugs. The hard part with the war on drugs is people demand drugs. Not everybody, but there's a certain population that do. And so when Richard Nixon declares this war on drugs, and then Ronald Reagan doubled down on this war on drugs, it became a really hot issue, specifically because of some of the racial injustices and how they classified crimes. So powder cocaine had a different penalty and drug sentence for crack cocaine. Powder cocaine was more popular among whites, crack cocaine among blacks. So there's a lot of racial issues as well when we talk about the war on drugs. But based on recent research, really, I want to point out that this war on drugs might be very much of a losing battle, and it's because of fentanyl. So fentanyl is a synthetic substitute to heroin. So it is 50 to 100 times more potent. This picture shows the dosage of heroin and fentanyl that is deadly. But fentanyl is 90% the cost of heroin. So we see these increases in the rise of deaths among those that are using heroin. It's really these synthetic opioids like fentanyl that's causing the damage. And so Jacob Miller, a professor who was formerly here at SUU, looked at this research and finds that even with you try to crack down on these dark webs, Silk Road and others, it has very little impact because it's so easy to mass produce fentanyl and to sell it throughout the United States. One of the largest producers of fentanyl in the United States was actually arrested in Salt Lake City. That's where he produced all his fentanyl. And so we talk about changes in public policy. There's policy that's happening right now. So in November 2020, Oregon voted to pass Measure 110. And what this does is it decriminalizes the possession of small quantities of drugs. So LSD, heroin, these drugs, if you have small quantities for personal use, it's still illegal and you could be fined, but you will no longer go to jail. For larger quantities, that's now a distribution, that's a penalty still, and you can go to jail for that. But for personal consumption, it's now decriminalizes that. And so they treat this with penalties and fines and addiction recovery plans. So if you have a repeated offender with these fines, you might be assigned to go to an addiction recovery program. And this is funded through taxes placed on recreational marijuana within the state. And so we're seeing a trend in this country to deal with drugs and to think about, is it worth it to criminalize drugs as we've done in the past, this war on drugs, or to possibly think about the economic consequences of that and try to decriminalize it and not send individuals to jail. And so these are stories that we've learned from Prohibition that can be applied to us today.